everyone. I'm Cheryl Harbison, Director of the Scandinavian Studies Program at UMass, and I welcome you to our long-anticipated discussion of the rapidly and radically changing demographics of Scandinavia. Thank you for bearing with our eccentric weather and the false ambushes of snow, which didn't happen. Count it to April Fool, I guess. Like any event on this scale, this one has been long in the making and has contributions from many people. First, I want to thank our symposium participants, making time in their busy lives for this exchange at this time in this place. They've come from as far away as Stockholm and Colorado, and we look forward with great anticipation to what they have to tell us about this very timeless subject from the front lines. Second, I thank our stalwart Scandinavian Studies Committee, with whom I work. Two of them dedicated enough to Scandinavia to keep working with us after their retirement. Emeritus Professor Eric Einhorn in political science. Our second speaker this afternoon has been fully engaged in this project from the beginning, and we couldn't have done without his expertise in Scandinavian politics and his generous commitment of retirement hours. My Scandinavian Studies colleagues on the literary side, Frank Hughes, Roger Steenland, and Emeritus Professor James Cathy, have contributed balance, wisdom, and much encouragement. There have been two other outstanding workhorses on the project. One is our Fulbright Hildeman Fellow, Marcus Huss, here this semester from Södertörn University in Stockholm. Marcus has been central to the conception and the execution of this symposium, not least through his upper level honors course, The Making of Multicultural Sweden, whose students have been working with these issues all semester and are with us this weekend. He and I are also hosting 7 separate sessions of scholarly presentations on the general topic of multicultural Scandinavia at the annual meeting of the Scandinavian Society for Advancement of Scandinavian Studies in May in Minneapolis. The most demanding, though, and most exasperating at times tasks here have been the practical arrangements and managing the publicity, and that has fallen to the shoulders of Carolina Hirte, who is hiding somewhere around here, not too far, who's our program's graduate student assistant, thorough, enthusiastic, and seemingly tireless. Her efficiency and capability and capacity for keeping up with myriad fast-moving tasks at once have kept me from tearing my hair many times. Also working on this front has been our program's exceptional office manager, Dokar Gyatsen, and we've had excellent technical support from Manish Tipiranini and Ryan LaLiberty and Stephen Warren, standing back there with his head in the clouds. The biggest prerequisite, of course, for any of this was the means to make it possible. The chief funding source has been a generous grant from the Barbara Osher Prosuecia Foundation in San Francisco. We've also had generous support from the UMass College of Humanities and Fine Arts, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the Program in European Studies, the International Programs Office, and our home base, the Program in German and Scandinavian Studies. So before we begin with our keynote speaker, I have 2 announcements. One is that there will be a reception at the end of today's talks down the hall to your right, out that way in the lobby. And that's also where our coffee breaks will take place both days. And second, that tomorrow we will be in a different room, the room just next door to where we are now. It's larger and we hope more comfortable for a longer day. So, our keynote speaker today is Grete Brockman from Oslo University. And she is professor of the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at Oslo University. I love the idea of human geography department. I don't think that many people have those. She's published widely on international migration and the Scandinavian welfare model, and has been on board member of PRIO, ARENA, Freedom of Expression Foundation, the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Swedish Research Council, FAS, among others. She's been a visiting scholar at Berkeley and Boston College, as well as Willy Brandt Professor at Malmö University. Brochmann is currently leading a governmental commission on international migration and the Norwegian welfare model. Her title today is Managing Immigration in the Scandinavian Welfare States. I thank her. Welcome, Greg.
Many thanks, Cheryl, for this generous introduction, and first and foremost, many thanks for this invitation to a interesting event for 2 days, and I'm looking very much forward to participating in the whole thing. As Cheryl said, my topic is really very central in Scandinavia these days. It has become much more central over the last years. In fact, I've been studying migration, international migration, since the beginning of the 80s. And when I started, many of my colleagues, they didn't even know what migration was. And so I was always told that my field of research was extremely exotic. And today, that's absolutely not the case anymore. And apart from the fact that it has become more topical over the years, immigration as such to Scandinavia is not a new phenomenon. Immigrants, long distance, but first and foremost migrants from closer surroundings, have entered the region for centuries, in fact. Nevertheless, what we today associate with the term immigrants, people coming from countries outside of the OECD, is basically a post-1960s phenomenon. However, these so-called new immigrants, as we call that category among the immigrants, started coming at different points in time within the Scandinavian area, and they have also varied greatly in numbers. And treating the three Scandinavian countries together in relation to immigration after the 60s is a somewhat untidy project, as there are cross-cutting similarities and differences among the three states, both in terms of institutional and political context, and as to the kind of immigrants who are actually coming, both concomitantly and over time. Yet, at the same time, there are sufficient similarities in the basic structural and institutional setup to undertake this comparative project. In this talk, I will give an overview of the approach to immigration policymaking in the three Scandinavian states over the last few decades. What has characterized Denmark, Sweden, and Norway in relation to immigration is three countries with similar economies, a number of common cultural traits, comparable welfare and labor market models, a high degree of social trust, yet at the same time, partly and at least up till 2015, which I'll come back to, quite different approaches to immigration and integration, particularly as to ideology and the way policies are legitimized. The refugee crisis of 2015 may have changed part of this schism, yet some of the cleavages will most likely remain in the foreseeable future. This is really a topic for discussion afterwards. I believe that 2015 made a turning point, and it also has the potential of changing many of the political features that I will describe in this talk today. The most notable changes took place in Sweden during the late fall of 2015. Border control was introduced together with a number of new restrictive measures in a move to try to curb the extraordinary inflow. And this was in many ways a full-scale shift in paradigm, bringing Sweden in line with the more restrictive EU member countries. In the talk, I will combine three analytical features: institutions, norms, and agency, in order to make sense of continuity and change in Scandinavia policymaking in this contentious field of research. I will first give you a brief historical review. It's always important to have the historical context present. The new immigrants started coming firstly to Sweden. Sweden had not been occupied by the Nazi regime during the Second World War and was thus in an economic lead in the region. The expansive Swedish labor market employed foreign labor from actually a quite early stage after the war. And this was first and foremost Finns, yet also people from further afield a bit later on. Immigration, this new immigration, started somewhat later in Denmark and Norway, basically from the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 70s. And when the new immigration started, all three countries had recently established comprehensive welfare systems. These welfare states, which strongly impacted on the way in which each country could handle immigration, resembled each other in many ways, and to the extent that they often figure internationally as one single unity, as we all know, the so-called Nordic model, which formally also include then Finland and Iceland. They were all small in terms of population and culturally relatively homogeneous societies in the northern part of Europe, which after the war were, to a slightly different degree internally, strongly influenced by social democratic parties. And they scored regularly in the top section in international investigations on societal trust, or generalized trust, as it's also called. The new immigration basically followed the same patterns from the late 1960s onwards until the last decade or so, where the differences are growing or have been growing. The first groups were labor immigrants from countries like Turkey, Yugoslavia, Morocco, and Pakistan, undertaking manual work in industry. Something happened here? Okay. It was left out. Sorry about that. Basically, they went into work in industry and increasingly in the service sector in all three countries. And this labor immigration lasted only till the early or the mid-1970s, namely a very short period, in fact, we're talking about here. At that time, a new strict regulation was introduced in the whole area, the so-called immigration stops. And these immigration stops were established first in Sweden in 1972, then in Denmark in 1973, and then lastly in Norway in 1975. And these stop policies, they follow by and large the same pattern as one could find all over Europe. The recruitment stops from this period, they represented a milestone in immigration policies in all the three countries in Scandinavia. And they introduced policy mechanisms with wide-reaching consequences for both direction, size, and composition of immigration in the decades to follow. And the goal of these stops was to curtail unwanted and unskilled immigration, while at the same time allowing for skilled migrants, which were in demand, especially in Norway. And in the early 1970s, Norway, as everybody today knows, Norway found oil in this period. So it was a booming economy and also with a large demand for foreign labor. So actually Norway had a sort of opposite business cycle introduced by the oil from the early 70s onwards. Whereas the oil crisis spurred restrictions all over Europe, the oil crisis was an oil boom in the Norwegian context. One legacy of the recruitment stops was actually a series of unforeseen consequences. As was the case in most receiving European countries, the immigration did not stop. It only changed character. There has never been more immigration to the Scandinavian countries than after the stop. When the legal channels were closed for low-skilled labor, foreigners arrived via other channels. For instance, as refugees or asylum seekers, or as family members of already settled immigrants. Sweden has all the way received more immigrants than the two other countries. And in 2015, the percentage of foreign-born persons was in Denmark roughly 9%, in Norway roughly 13%, and in Sweden around 16%. The number of immigrants from non-OECD countries has increased significantly because of international conventions and the general humanitarian platform of the Scandinavian social democracies. So the categories of immigrants have fluctuated in similar ways over time, and the political tools supplied were for long quite similar. The majority of those entering the region from the global south have generally had a lower employment rate than the majority population, making them a natural target for active labor market policies. Ideologically, the three countries were strongly influenced by the new radical human rights thinking of the 60s and the 70s as to the premises for immigrant inclusion. What has been labeled integration or also multiculturalism. And this approach, which was applied with different emphasis among the three states, took on a dual character. The state stood for both active governance in order to hinder social and economic marginalization of the incoming people, and for actively promoting actually cultural diversity. Yet there have also been significant differences between the three countries, accentuated over time with important consequences for the round of immigration. Sweden was for long the leading immigrant state in the region, both in terms of seniority, scope, and also policymaking. As an early mover as concerns active recruitment of foreign labor, and in terms of human rights diligence. The Swedish authorities took on a pioneer role in formulating integration ideology and policy, with strong impact on the two other receiving states. And this is so particularly in an early stage, and particularly also in relation to Norway. After the 1980s, this was in fact less pregnant, as both Denmark and Norway have chosen different paths in a number of policy fields. Pertaining to public discourse, there are also marked differences between the three, and this has also been reinforced over time. The tenor of the debate has turned much tougher in Denmark the last decades or the last decade or two, with stronger representation of immigration critical voices. Danish policy has also turned more restrictive since the turn of the century, both in terms of immigration regulation and in terms of social policy. And Norway has followed the Danish development to a certain extent, whereas Sweden has kept much of its more liberal and immigrant-friendly approach up until today. The role of populist parties on the right is also relevant in this context. Denmark has had a loud immigration opposition since the 1970s through the Progress Party, Fremskrittspartiet, later called the Danish People's Party. The Norwegian equivalent, Progress Party, Fremskrittspartiet, got tailwind first with the general election in 1987, after having started capitalizing on the immigration issue in the public. Sweden has followed a somewhat different course, with strong norms as to how immigration should be discussed publicly, and it's only with the parliamentary election in 2014 that the populist right, the Swedish Democrats, has got a substantial representation in the parliament, in Riksdagen. Finally, as to the external political conditions, the three states have chosen different forms of affiliation to the European Union. Sweden has a complete membership since 1995, except the monetary union, EMU. Denmark has been member since 1973, but has opted out of the common immigration policy, justice, freedom and security, as well as the EMU. Whereas Norway has remained outside of the EU proper. But on the other hand, Norway has joined both the Schengen and the Dublin agreements with wide-ranging consequences for immigration policy making. And also the EEA, European Economic Area affiliation, has also made Norway part of the internal market, which has resulted in substantial labor immigration from the EU area. So it's a very mixed picture when it comes to the EU topic in Scandinavia. Now we may ask which factors are the major drivers for policymaking in the realm of immigration in Scandinavia. And I would assert that of all institutional elements relevant for understanding immigration policymaking in the area, the welfare model, including labor relations, deserves the label master institution. The model largely explains both the basic formation of the original approach of the 1970s and the continuous maintenance and adjustments in the decades that has followed afterwards. Gösta Esping Andersen and Walter Korpi they have characterized the Nordic model as comprehensive regarding the kinds of social needs it tries to satisfy, as institutionalized via social rights that give all citizens a right to a decent standard of living, and as solidaristic and universal in the sense that the welfare policy serves the entire population, not just particularly exposed groups, which is the case in many other welfare models. And this welfare model is structurally linked to a highly centralized organization of working life. These are very essential features. The regulation of the labor market via collective agreements, tripartite cooperation, and active labor market policy have, combined with welfare security, contributed to productive economies with good flexibility and also high human capital. Work, life, and welfare have represented mutual buffer functions with a high employment rate and an economic buttress. Employment both finances welfare and reduces public spendings. State control and planning constitute major ingredients in the system, which is basically tax-based, which is also very important. Equal treatment is a key element in this system, and the only criterion for accessing basic income security is actually legal residency. That is also quite unique when you compare different welfare models internationally. This master institution was in place in all three countries roughly at the same time in history as the countries started being exposed to this new immigration. Immigration was, on the other side, not taken into consideration when the institutions were planned and designed. Immigration was not yet, in the 60s, a politicized issue, and the governments had no possibilities of foreseeing the extent to which immigration was going to escalate in the years to come. The Nordic model turned out as generous, yet bounded. It presupposed territorial delimitation, the benefits being intended for its resident members, that means in the beginning intended for their citizens. So the character of bounded universalism had basically two implications for policymaking related to immigration, which materialized in these stop policies, as I mentioned. Firstly, controlling the inflow was seen as a prerequisite for the sustenance of the system as such. As the scope of social rights was extensive and therefore also expensive, inflow control was a chief concern. And ideally, only labor in demand was to be let in. Secondly, the Nordic model was, with its finely balanced welfare and labor nexus, necessitated equal treatment of newcomers. This dual situation is extremely central. This element was in particular argued by the labor unions because they were afraid, of course, of low-wage competition and also the undermining of the hard-won labor standards. Good welfare states could systemically not accept substantial members of society not being productively absorbed in the labor market, thus disturbing the regulated world of work and also burden the social budgets. And this in many ways reflect a T.H. Marshall way of recognizing that a society cannot function properly if a large part of the population is marginalized and also socially excluded. Integration policy beyond the labor market inclusion added to this logic. To have newcomers become full members of their new home countries, an active effort had to be made by the states in order to facilitate well-functioning citizens for these new residents. This dualism, the restrictive access policy combined with the inclusive and equality-oriented labor market and welfare approach, was to mark the three countries for the following decades. There is something wrong with this. Now we should be doing better. This dualism that I'm talking about, it was only disturbed basically by the EU free labor market, which particularly after the membership extension in 2004 implied free access for all EU citizens to seek employment. This was a drastic change in many ways. So in terms of the institutional prerequisites, the EU externalities, intentionally induced by all three states, drastically changed preconditions for governance in the area of immigration after this point. Now let's look at the normative side, at human rights and integration ideology. If governance were straightforward according to national economic interests in the realm of immigration, then very few immigrants would have entered Scandinavia between the stop policies of the 70s and the liberalization of labor immigration policies in the early 2000s. The reason why Sweden, Denmark, and Norway received more immigrants after the 1970s than ever before in history belong in the normative sphere. Sweden was a pioneer in Scandinavia in the normative and ideological realm. in relation to immigration governance. Having received immigrants from an early stage after World War II, Sweden was in the lead in terms of experience with cultural diversity and labor market inclusion. The country also positioned itself as sort of a humanitarian superpower in the post-war era. And as early as in the 1960s, the first documents materialized in Sweden as concerned new approaches to immigration and this integration field. The main principle should be a responsible access policy. That means the number let in should be balanced against the capacity to include them, as well as equal treatment within a welfare stately context. In 1974, the iconic catchphrases for the integration policy was launched. Jämlikhet, valfrihet och samverkan. Equality, freedom of choice, and cooperation. These ploys indicated a dual approach. The newcomers should be able to achieve the same socio-economic standard as the natives, at the same time being free to choose their cultural affiliation. Language instruction in Sweden should be offered, yet no one should be pressured into Swedishness in a cultural sense. And minorities should even receive state funding to cultivate their original culture. Equality and cooperation were well-known concepts from the general Swedish policy repertoire, but freedom of choice appeared as an anomaly in the heavily conformity-oriented Sweden. This nowadays controversial term assimilation, homogenization and streamlining culturally and economically had actually been seen as a necessary and natural part of nation building and modernization processes that characterized Sweden as well as Denmark and Norway in the post-war era. And social engineering had, through the politician spouses Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, been given a very central role. And within this social engineering, a central part was addressing people's values and attitudes. Gunnar Myrdal played a key role during the pre-war formative years of this social engineering thinking. And he could say things like, bad habits must be put right, and consumption needs to be directed. People must be accustomed to brushing their teeth and eating tomatoes. And he was not even alien to the idea of guiding decoration and renovation of homes. The Swedish historian Yvonne Hirdman refers to these early social engineers as the internal decorators of the people's home. However, when the new immigrants arrived and cultural streamlining was explicitly exempted from their introduction to life in Sweden, it had, of course, ambiguous effects for inclusion and cooperation. It's interesting that Sweden, the country where this social engineering had been elaborated furthest in Scandinavia, also became the pioneer in multicultural liberality. Sweden actually made this diversity approach part of their continuous nation-building process after the 70s. Traditional Swedish values were toned down in favor of values related to human rights and democracy. This early multicultural thinking was for long uncritically adopted in Norway, whereas it was more modified from an early stage in Denmark. Norway followed Swedish immigration policy making very closely, and catchwords were copied and made public documents, and many public documents were strongly influenced, both ideologically and also very practically from the Swedish side. And one can also follow chronologically, reforms in Norway that always comes a couple of years after they have taken place in Sweden. Denmark, on the other hand, applied ideologically a more national approach from the beginning. Danish language and culture should have a privileged position in the integration process, and the Danes were early out in making demands on newcomers. In Denmark, the equality approach meant absence of special treatment. Yet, even Denmark introduced many of the Swedish novelties also, like voting rights in local elections, mother tongue education, and also economic support to cultural organizations. So the differences should not be exaggerated. The interplay between norms and institutions explains to a large extent the original approach to the new immigration in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. The new post-war human rights regime, in combination with welfare stately prerequisites, molded a new political opportunity structure in which immigration was to be fitted in. Various kinds of actors entered this field, within the authorities, among the political parties, and among external activists and researchers, many of whom were influenced by this radical zeitgeist in this period, relating to cultural pluralism and tolerance. In Sweden, the positive pioneer role partly resulted from the fact that the largest groups among the immigrants were actually Finns, who were attractive labor power for the industry and thus served the economy very well. This group succeeded in many ways also in claims making, both socially and culturally, and they paved the way for the following culturally less familiar immigrant group that came later. The pluralist or multicultural ideology had a strong impact, probably because it reconciled ruling ideology with systemic necessities. At the same time, the Scandinavian approach revealed a tacit unease between different measures for justice and welfare. The American philosopher Nancy Fraser has formulated this as the tension between the politics of recognition versus the politics of redistribution. The ambitious social policy of the three Scandinavian countries has traditionally aimed at using the tax system, services, as well as various kinds of social engineering in order to level out class differences in society. The redistribution was supposed to be done in a color-blind way, equal treatment regardless of cultural and social background. The recognition policy, on the other hand, appreciates that injustice does have a cultural and also a symbolic dimension. Some groups' values and identities render them invisible and subjugated when they're not specifically recognized beyond this equal treatment approach. And the integration policies of Scandinavia were ideally to do both these things. On the one hand, secure newcomers access to equal rights and the possibilities of social mobility, and on the other hand, create room for the conservation and cultivation of their original culture and religious luggage. These two agendas, they have increasingly been conflicting in the three countries since the initiation of these integration policies. Cultural and religious affiliations have more frequently now been seen as obstacles to equal rights in practice. That means equality in terms of social and livelihood performance, as well as social mobility over time. And women's rights are most commonly addressed as an issue within this schism. Now let's look at the immigration policy in practice for a while. The immigration policy introduced, as I mentioned, during the 1970s, presupposed that immigration could be governed according to labor demand and welfare capacity. rather quickly the states were confronted with a quite different reality. Partly this was caused by a number of refugee-producing conflicts internationally, combined with easier and cheaper international transportation. Yet humanitarian migrants also came as a result of the new immigration regime as such. When the labor migration options were curtailed, people searched for other openings. So the right to family life and the right to protection from persecution became new essential criteria for legal residency. And through this, some of the basis for this new policy making was altered. The new patterns of immigration could not be handled with the tools instituted by this fresh new regulation. Both the asylum policy and the family immigration policy should not be managed according to national interests, but according to humanitarian norms and conventions. And actually, these categories of migrants were going to dominate the public immigration discourse in the decades that followed, particularly after the late 1980s, when the numbers escalated. Sweden has been the great asylum receiver in the region, attracting and allowing a significant higher number of refugees over the years than Denmark and particularly than Norway and particularly Denmark. And this pattern has continued into the 2000s, and even after the change of tide with the EU extension in 2004, Sweden still has a proportionally much larger refugee influx than its neighboring countries. And this description was taken to the extreme during the refugee crisis in 2015. And this in turn implies that Sweden has also become the great receiver in relation to family or secondary immigration due to the so-called network effect. And all the three countries have intentionally, as I have underlined, the same basic structure of the immigration policy approach when it comes to the interplay between access policy and welfare stately integration policy. A intentionally restrictive front, and on the other hand, an inclusive and equal rights-oriented inside. So until the turn of the century, the concrete integration policy was also roughly similar, although with national specificities. And the nerve center of contention has been the question of legitimacy in relation to asylum seekers. Who could claim need for protection with reference to the UN asylum or the Refugee Convention? And who should be able to stay even if those criteria were not fulfilled? And who should be able to stay in the end, what were the real possibilities of having control through governance in this complicated and very complex field of policymaking? The legitimacy question as a device for governance turned more pressing during the 1990s, and the worries concerning the sustainability of the welfare states when that issue came up front in all three countries. And this again more so in Denmark and Norway than in Sweden. I mean, the challenges were the same, but it was discussed more openly in Denmark and Norway. It became more evident that the immigrants from the global south had significant employment problems in the advanced Scandinavian labor markets, and thus posing challenges to the welfare model. And paradoxically, the heat of this debate turned stronger in Denmark and Norway at the same time as Sweden actually was the country that was hardest hit by the economic crisis in the early 1990s, and also with the strongest influx. So that tells a lot about, I mean, the discipline of the Swedish public discourse in this realm. And during the same decade, family immigration became a true target for policymaking as well. The states were realizing that the self-perpetuating mechanisms of the inflow related to this kind of immigration. Accepted immigrants generated secondary immigration, and often to a larger extent than the original, as family reunification meant residence permit to spouses and children. Some minority groups also practiced arranged marriages with persons from the parents' sending country, which in practice became also an important secondary immigration channel. The 1990s, nevertheless, turned out as the decade during which all three countries tried harder to delimit the inflows, at the same time realizing more clearly that the space of maneuvering was greatly constrained. The three countries also gradually realized elements of internal regime competition among in this region. When one of the countries introduced restrictions, the others experienced increased flows. At the turn of the century, Denmark, with its new liberal coalition government, this Fogh Rasmussen government from 2001, started a significant and comprehensive reform process of the Danish immigration regime. And this new government pulled several strings at the same time. The family immigration policy was the main target, yet also the refugee policy turned more restrictive. And as concerns family reunion, the new ruling required that both spouses had to be more than 24 years old, and they would be required also to have a stronger connection as a couple to Denmark than to any other country. The possibly most striking reform was nevertheless the new dualization of the basic income support. Newcomers now would need 7 years of residency before accessing the full social security allowance in Denmark. And this last reform, which was rolled back when the Social Democratic Coalition government of Thorning-Schmidt took over in 2011, and then reintroduced again by the Løkke Rasmussen government in 2015, it actually defied one of the pillars of the Nordic model, which is the universality principle. Denmark was the first mover in this endeavor, and the numbers went down significantly in the first following years after this major turn. And neither Sweden nor Norway followed suit in these major retrenchments, although Norway actually introduced a few reforms that was designed differently, yet to the same effect as the Danish reforms. And also both Sweden and Norway introduced an economic self-sufficiency requirement for family reunification. And all three countries stepped up their efforts in the return policy directed at asylum seekers who had their applications turned down. And these tougher policies for humanitarian immigrants came at the same time as a shift in paradigm related to labor immigration. Even before the EU extension eastward, all three countries, and here also including Finland and Iceland, had realized a need for access to foreign labor and skilled labor in particular. During a short time span, roughly from the late 1990s till the financial crisis in 2008, public debate on immigration changed character in many ways, from being focused on the welfare burden of the humanitarians into a positive attitude related to necessary extra labor in order to preserve the level of welfare. This was a trend throughout Western Europe, in fact, and all the receiving countries in Europe were competing for the Indian IT engineers. At the same time, worries related to unwanted immigrants lingered right under the surface. A dualized policy resulted from this schism. A continued restrictive policy, most markedly in Denmark and least so in Sweden, combined with an open access for EU labor. And Sweden was in fact alone in introducing a demand-side liberalization towards labor immigrants also from third countries in 2008. So Sweden was clearly more liberal than the rest of Europe by and large. But the inflow of EU workers was particularly high in Norway due to the strong oil economy. As concerns the integration policies proper, the differences have been fewer between the three countries over the last decade. And this is probably explained by the common basic features of the welfare labor model in the three countries. So when people have managed to get in legally, the systemic imperatives is to have them included in the best way possible. Consequently, any well-functioning policy instrument invented in one of the countries would most likely be copied the other places. And a common denominator for integration policies in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway since the 1990s is a much stronger emphasis on the so-called work-line approach. To have people included through work has become the common mantra, economically and socially, and most of the efforts in policy innovation has been within this work-line field. But there has been a continued difference between the three countries in the ways in which the authorities has implemented this work-line policy. And following the usual Scandinavian schism, Sweden believes in motivation, Denmark uses sanctions more than the others, and Norway follows a middle way, oscillating between the Danish and the Swedish line. So by way of conclusion, all the three Scandinavian countries, although in different ways and also to different degrees, are today facing major challenges in relation to international migration. Today, immigration has turned into a central driver for economic, social, and political change in the whole region. The systemic qualities of the Nordic model, to a large extent, premised the national approaches to immigration from the outset, as I have emphasized. Now, the scale of immigration is one of the major factors that actually is prompting policy reforms in the model in order to make it more robust on both labor standards and welfare sustainability. But the scope of action is not very wide. Systemic premises as well as international agreements limit the maneuvering space to a very large extent. And all three countries are trying to balance economic interests and humanitarian responsibilities in their immigration policies. And this has nevertheless resulted in three maybe surprisingly different approaches to this immigration integration nexus. But Scandinavia is at a crossroad in relation to immigration, generally speaking. Sweden has made a U-turn, making convergence a tentatively more relevant concept now. And all three countries face sustainability problems in their welfare policies, more generally speaking, caused primarily by other forces than immigration, with the aging up front. Yet large-scale immigration of people with problems in supporting themselves add, of course, to these challenges. And I do believe that we will witness major adjustments in the region in the years to come. The refugee crisis most probably served as a catalyst for the policymakers, and painfully so. A generous refugee policy has for long served as a symbol of the humanitarian baseline of the Nordic model, although I would also say that this point can be exaggerated, because refugee policies, as I have talked about, have been a target for retrenchment since the 1980s in the region, and again strongest in Denmark and weakest in Sweden. Thank you so far. Shall I sit down or?
Well, if we're going to have questions, maybe you should stay where you can be heard.
Okay.
You want to turn around?
Sure. Do you? Okay. So, are the people going to ask questions?
You can start,
Okay.
and then we'll have simple.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Stokes-DePass, and I'm from Holy Family University, and it is an honor to respond to your paper. And Dr. Bruckman's paper really opens with the very apt assessment that the Nordic welfare model is the holiest cow, right, that represents the master value and master institution of Scandinavian society. But after outlining several of the challenges that were discussed throughout the presentation and the paper, she concludes with an optimistic view, right, that the cow can be preserved as a result of, again, high public buy-in and high public trust in political institutions and states. That said, I would like to initiate our discussion and talk about some of these challenges in greater detail to the Scandinavian welfare model and emerging multiculturalism in the region. Dr. Brockman cites two concepts by economist Gunnar Myrdal. The first, protective social policy, the ethos of equal opportunity, redistributed economics, and empowerment of the disadvantaged via public education and access to health care and active labor policies. The second concept, social engineering, where boundaries are blurred between private and personal behaviors and the need to intervene on the part of the state, as you said, to right bad behaviors as they occur in the interest of the public good. Can these two concepts that are heavily steeped in the Scandinavian welfare policy coexist unchanged or unchallenged in an age of mass migration with, again, within and also outside of the European Union? And can also coupled with growing domestic growth in ethnic population in terms of second, third, and fourth generations in many of these countries. So that's a question I would put to the room. Is there a space for these concepts to remain embedded and seeped into the welfare model in an age of change? Do the concepts have to change, or does the model have to ultimately change? That's a big question. But I think it's the elephant in the room. Yeah. So the students who've been studying this whole semester, I'll do to you what I do to my students. I'm going to put you on the spot. Those of you who have been discussing this all semester, what are some of your thoughts on how the Nordic model the sacred cow can stay sacred amid all of this change?
Can I answer your question with another question? If so,
Okay.
I volunteer to go first. So we've been talking a lot in the seminar about sort of precursors to social difference in Sweden in particular, because that's the focus of the seminar, but generally in Scandinavia. And that's kind of like was the historical approach. Like you had mentioned at the beginning of the talk, like we have to think about the history of it before we can move forward into the future. And I think that's would be an interesting place to probe to try to get the answer to, like, do the policies need to change because of the changing conditions? Because the conditions weren't static like prior to the development of the welfare state either, right? And so I don't know. I would think maybe looking closer at other internal minorities or not conserved for this new immigrant group. What have been their experiences generationally removed from the immigration experience? Do they believe the welfare state is a successful model? Is it all okay 40 years later? Or is it not? And like, what are the actual experiences of that? And we were able to read some examples of scholarship, that's been studying kind of those intergenerational dynamics. But for me, that's kind of one area we could look to see, well, really, like, what happens? Do we assume integration just happens because those policies have been put in place? Does it really? Like, what does it mean? What are the effects and results? So I think that's maybe one direction to think in.
Well, is there less, I mean, I guess a lot of my work has sort of pushed back on that to say that is there a bit of elasticity in the view of who can claim Scandinavian identity, especially again in cultures that, societies rather, that are up to third and fourth generation. You have demographics of specifically non-white, non-Christian, demographics of second and third generations that have greater distance in terms of legitimacy in claiming that identity. So they may not necessarily buy into those two concepts as directly as the sort of quote-unquote native population, I put that in quotations on purpose, would. So in other words, high trust in public institutions, buy-in in terms of its, the same level of investment in the structures that create the Nordic model. So in my research, I question if the concept of Swedishness, Danishness, Norwegianness cannot expand to include these populations, they will have a challenge going forward in terms of newer generations having the same level of investment and trust. That's the hypothesis of my work. But a question, you know, that I put out to the room, and I think sort of a part B. Well, first of all, before I go into, anybody else want to take a stab at the big question before I kind of chunk it down a bit? Oh, good.
Well, I have a question also that I'm just wondering about, to clarify this. So I'm a history major. I'm not a Scandinavian major, so I'm not sure about the legal structures in the Nordic countries we're discussing. But I'm wondering about like constitutional provisions that may inform these policies. As we're kind of talking about this in a cultural sense, but I'm wondering in like kind of a constitutional sense, how the kind of provisions within the constitutions of Denmark, Sweden, Norway may kind of direct these policies in a way that spans over a longer period of time.
Do you want to address it? Yes, please.
Good question, and one of the things that's interesting and comes up frequently in the debate are the ambiguities of the constitutional system. First of all, every one of these countries, of course, has a liberal democratic constitution and has had for quite some time, but there's some ambiguity. So, for example, there's freedom of religion, but there is also a state church, at least there was until very recently a state church, which was privileged. So you get that sort of gray area between freedom of religion, but also Christian education in schools and things of that sort. Now that's changing too in response to the diversity of the society, but it has been a big issue. Also, there's no tradition apart. Maybe Norway's a partial exception. There's no Supreme Court to sort of dictate, you might say, or to say what are the rights. That is decided politically. So you have much more decided in the parliamentary give and take, and that's why you can have in Denmark such significant differences from one government to another, because parliament is supreme within very wide ranges. So it is an interesting these sort of technical legal factors do play a role.
Are you staying in the same line or going in a different direction?
I think in terms of kind of large scale, going today kind of historical developments, some people see this not only in Scandinavia but all over the world as the crisis of the post-World War II value system, which set up the right to asylum and humanitarian rights as the inalienable responsibility of democratic governments. And they're concepts that were not quantified. It was a universal right. And so now you have national economies and governments that are trying to balance out this very deep value of World War II value in the literal Western world with a very different changing demographic communication systems, economic systems. So some would say that the crisis is kind of bigger, and it is related to really long-term historical developments.
Well, just a quick note on this that, I guess I'm not a political scientist, but historically most social programs in Scandinavia are not needs tested. One of the underlying assumptions behind that type of model is that the notion of an imagined solidarity, right, or a kind of homogeneity. And so I guess one of the questions about, you might put up the question of, folks from outside the Christian tradition, outside of the kind of Caucasian appearance, right, that really presses against and I'm sure we're going to hear more about this in Ben's talk and other talks today and tomorrow. I guess that's that question of of imagined solidarity as being how key is that for the non-mean testing of really important programs like Dog and the Dog.
Do you want to respond?
I don't. What kind of role do you want me to play in at this point?
You should speak to anything that
Yeah, okay, because
It's central to your paper, I figured.
there's many interesting points coming up here, and what Eric says about the constitutional aspects, I do think is worth underlining, because the state church system in Scandinavia has been extremely important as a background for understanding what the policies have been like in relation to the issue of religion in the migration field. And Sweden does not have a state church anymore. Denmark has some kind of a state church still, and Norway was supposed to dismantle this state church system, and some people say that it was dismantled last year. As far as I'm concerned, this is only a semi kind of new structure that still privileges the Lutheran Church to a large extent. But paradoxically, what we have found in all three countries is that since there has been such a strong relationship between the state and the constitutional aspects and a new plural religious situation, is that, I mean, it has been compensated tremendously through the economic system, so that, I mean, minority religious groups have got state funding like nothing else on earth. And this has had lots of unforeseen consequences also that the states are struggling with today. And I suspect that in the coming few years we will see changes in this policy. And it will be more legitimate not to compensate so strongly when this state church institution is more or less waning. But that has been an extremely important aspect. And also Sweden actually has cultural rights written into its constitution. And that's the only country as far as I know, in Europe having done that, which also is a part of this the schism within Scandinavia in terms of liberality in relation to the cultural aspects of the integration field.
The other piece to your comment is the terrain more cultural? And is the conversation, in other words, could the law sort of adjudicate some of these issues that are more cultural, or could the Constitution adjudicate that? And I would say, based on all we've talked about here, the answer is no. It's more, I think, what does citizenship mean in a cultural sense? What does identity mean? And identity politics are framed often in a cultural sense. So I would argue the terrain is becoming more and more cultural in terms of these conversations. Another piece, sorry, I don't want to, okay, please.
Yes, I want to respond to comments a little more, which is that your point about the rights not being means tested is really important, but you have a combination of kind of these cultural forces pushing out recent immigrants, with the fact that recent migrants in Sweden are more likely to not have access to the non-means tested part of welfare, so to be supported by social assistance, which is means tested. As you have this kind of dual marginalization where they have access to the welfare state, but not the good parts, right? Not the parts that produce solidarity combined with this notion of enduring cultural difference. And I think that has something to do with non-whiteness and non-Christenness. So they're combined, they're not separate issues.
Thank you. I saw another hand, but it went down. I'm sorry. Did you want to take us in a different area, or?
Actually, no, I wanted to ask a question that was basically his question.
Please. Go ahead.
Oh, no, like he literally asked more or less what I was going to say.
Oh, stole your thunder. Okay. So another point that was identified in Dr. Brockman's paper, and specifically in her remarks, is that the Syrian refugee crisis really marked a policy turning point, particularly for Sweden, in 2015, bringing them more in line with their Nordic neighbors in terms of the issue of retrenchment, in terms of immigration or migration entry, and increased securitization, or focused on increased securitization of borders. Yet, while there's more ideological coherence in terms of view on the refugee crisis, there's still great disagreement in terms of how to manage this internally, and also in terms of discourse on how to manage this externally, at least in terms of other approaches being posed by other EU member states. So as long as this disagreement exists both internally and externally on quote-unquote solutions, the question I want to put to the room is there a potential space for more coherence on what a multicultural Scandinavia looks like? Is this a potential opportunity for policies, at least in terms of how multiculturalism is viewed in the region? Is there a potential space for more coherence there? So in other words, could this event also be a turning point in terms of thinking? Yeah.
It definitely could, but I think it's problematic if we look at who actually took up refugees in large numbers, right? And Sweden did so, and Denmark sort of reinforces like non-commitment to such a policy. So I think that's the starting point where you would kind of doubt that there could be a whole Scandinavian, like, similar multicultural approach. That's where we already start to differ.
Well, I'm curious to see too, because they've taken very different positions on sort of what the external solution might be. So in terms of Austria, Germany, and just went blank on the third group, the UK obvious exit. So this sort of notion of could there be a potential for this issue to unite? And I like to think in terms of could this be a place of agency or space for potential agency? But again, am I alone in that thinking? Yeah.
Oh, I'm afraid I'm not going to speak to that question,
Okay.
I suppose, at the end there. But to get back to this question of is there going to be perhaps a new coordination, a new sort of unification, despite this history of fragmentation and divergence in Scandinavian countries? One thing, and Judith and I were speaking about this earlier, that's a bit of a paradox, you could say, about what has happened in Sweden, is that yes, there has been this sort of U-turn in terms of policy. You see the actual practices, control of the border, kind of starting to mimic much more what we see in Denmark and Norway. But I think it's a much more open question, not with a black or white response, as to whether or not the public rhetoric surrounding immigration, integration, Swedishness, non-Swedishness, has that taken a similar U-turn? It's changed. I'm not sure that I could say that it has totally taken a U-turn. And if we're talking about a new future, a new way of thinking about things, whether it's good or bad, I would expect it to register in the realms of political discourse and rhetoric, perhaps more so than it has so far.
Other thoughts?
No, I just am having a hard time hearing you.
Oh.
Speaking to you and not the other way, and I wish there was a microphone.
There's a travel mic. Yeah.
I'd like just quickly to respond. I mean, we have to be clear about the difference between immigration policy and integration policy. That is very different issues. And when it comes to the refugee crisis and its impact on immigration policy, we need to have a broader viewpoint than only Scandinavia, because I mean this is going to be handled internationally, and it's absolutely necessary to generate a new policy on the EU level when it comes to the refugee issues. So I suspect that the Scandinavian countries, they are under the surface trying to influence on the EU level. Norway cannot do that, but Sweden and Denmark. And waiting it out in a way to see what's going on this supranational level before reforms are undertaken within the nation states, because it is so vital. And that was absolutely obvious to everyone during the refugee crisis, that it was the EU that really collapsed in its way of handling these important issues, and therefore the countries had to take it into their own hands and reintroduce border control. When it comes to the integration policies and the generosity in terms of giving people access, giving people protection, I mean, Denmark has got a too negative image internationally, as far as I'm concerned, because Denmark has for years now wanted to signal hostility. I mean, to be able to receive fewer people, but substantially, Denmark has had as generous refugee policy as the other countries, and the proportion that receives protection of the number that applies for asylum is remarkably high in Denmark. So this is a very, very mixed picture. And now, after the refugee crisis, we have a different situation rhetorically also. But Sweden is as restrictive as Denmark and Norway now when it comes to rights policies, integration policies, and control policies. The convergence aspect in that sense is very clear. But both Denmark and Norway has strongly wanted to signal hostility externally after 2015, whereas Sweden has not changed their international rhetoric. And that has actually also implied that Sweden has continued to receive quite a high number of asylum seekers after 2015, whereas Denmark and Norway have managed to get the figures extremely low. 30,000 asylum seekers entered Sweden in 2016. I mean, people managed to come to Sweden despite the border control situation, and the major reason is probably the network effect. That is always very strong in Sweden because of former immigration rates, but I suspect myself that it has also to do with this rhetorical side, because Sweden has not started communicating this more hostile, restrictive situation as actually both Norway and Denmark now are undertaking.